Well, congratulations on the movie.
Thank you.
I thought it was fantastic. I love the scene in the film where Anna and Vronsky are dancing, and you do that fantastic one shot of them, and all the characters start moving around them as they come closer. I was watching Pride and Prejudice again yesterday, and I noticed there was a very similar scene with Keira Knightley and Mr. Darcy, where you kind of do something similar. Those scenes are so beautiful, and can you talk about the decision of why you chose to film it that way with the dancers, with Aaron Johnson and Keira Knightley?
I guess I wanted to kind of... Sorry, this isn't going to work. Hold on. I thought it seemed like a good idea.
It's kind of a big mint.
I had one earlier and was chewing to get it out of my mouth.
So sorry. There we go. It's rather gross. Why did I choose to film it that way? Because I wanted a kind of fluidity and a romanticism to it. I'd really enjoyed doing those sequences in Pride and Prejudice and wanted to kind of develop those ideas further and work with a kind of choreography that was more expressive rather than just kind of strictly period dance, you know. I felt that the film, because of the overall stylization, would support something that was more expressive and balletic. Yeah, I guess something like that.
I read a quote of yours where you said, every time I make a film, I feel like it gives me a chance to learn something new.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, what do you think you learned from doing Anna Karenina?
Well, I guess, you know, I learned lots of things. I learned a lot about Russia in the 1870s and Russian culture. I learned a lot about Russian literature and not just Tolstoy, but Pushkin and all of them really. And I kind of looked a lot also at the Russian avant-garde of the post-revolutionary period, pre-Stalin, and so all of that I was fascinating. I also learned on a personal level to trust myself a bit more. The idea of this kind of theatrical idea was something that I'd been thinking about or looking for some time, but never quite had the balls to follow through. So with this movie, I decided to throw caution to the wind and do it, and so I guess I've learned possibly to trust myself a little bit more.
Okay. All right, well, I loved how you adapted the famous quote of Shakespeare, all the world's a stage and all the men and women are merely players. Walk us through the process of making Anna Karenina on this stage that was the majority of the film, and how you fused it with the stage and the film.
Well, it seemed to me that the stage was an interesting metaphor for the way in which the Russian society lived at the time. They were suffering from a bit of an identity crisis and weren't quite sure whether they were Eastern or Western, and they chose to be French, Parisian. They spoke French, they wore Parisian fashions, they read etiquette books on how to behave as if in polite French society, and so they were kind of performing. They sort of lived their lives as if upon a stage, and so the theatre seemed like an appropriate metaphor. And also Anna and all the characters really are engaged in a performance of their own lives. She's taken on this role of mother and wife, and the role no longer really suits her, and she kicks against that role. I wonder if the Indians would call that dharma. So that was where the idea came from. And then it just was about carefully thinking the thing through and working out how to realise that in each and every moment.
I'm curious about the stage too. What characteristics, some scenes were just right there on stage, and then some felt very real life, and then everything in between in the backstage. So what would make you pick something to highlight as being on the stage, and then other scenes not?
Well, the whole film takes place in the theatre apart from Levin's story, and also apart from 2 scenes between Anna and Vronsky. And Levin's story, Levin kind of turns his back on that society and decides to seek a more authentic form of life.
Right.
So that was one reason for making that choice. And also, the book is really 2 books in one. It's the story of Anna Karenina, and that's a fiction. But it's also the story of Levin and Kitty, and Levin really is an autobiographical portrait of Tolstoy. In fact, he kept a journal his entire life, but except for during the 4 years he was writing Anna Karenina. And when asked why he stopped during that period, he said, if you want to know what was happening with me, read Levin. And so I felt that I kind of was interested in the idea that actually it was an autobiography and a fiction fused, or kind of working as a double helix around itself. And so I was trying to find cinematic equivalents for those different literary techniques or forms.
I'm going to bounce off of Rebecca here. I was so engulfed in the story, and your film is so unique because we see kind of that production side of the film, and then we are so involved in the story as well. How were you able to create that balance between the two and keep the audience so involved in the story?
Well, I think by use of close-ups a lot. I mean, there are a lot of close-ups in the movie, and when you're in a close-up, it doesn't matter where we are, As I look at you now, you've just got a bit of white wall behind you and a bit of brick, regardless of the fact that we're standing here sitting in a chimney stack. So it's really about what you choose not to show at any given moment. And that was one of the most difficult challenges of making the film, was that balance that you're talking about. And it took, some figuring out.
Sure.
Can you talk about your experience with the past adaptations of the book? Like, did you see past movies, television, and film?
I haven't. I've only seen one of them, and that was the Greta Garbo talking version. She did a silent film and a talkie, but I wasn't really that interested in watching them. Well, I was scared of watching them, is the truth. I was kind of nervous to watch them, but at the same time wanted to know what they were like. So I kept on asking people what they were like, and had they done this, and had they done that. And what I discovered was that most adaptations didn't involve Levin and Kitty. And therefore, if you don't have Levin and Kitty as the light and the hope, then you either end up with a very bleak story of Anna, or you change Anna's story. And it seems to me that what most adaptations have done is change Anna's story. And they've made her a heroine, a victim, a martyr. And for me, that's not really the point of what Tolstoy was trying to do. She lives in a period that is deeply unjust towards women and deeply hypocritical, but it's really her own obsessive form of what she thinks to be love that is her undoing. and so I think this version of Anna Karenina is a lot more ambivalent towards Anna herself, and indeed Karenina and Vronsky. But that's only possible because one has Levin and Kitty there too, to give us the happy ending, if you like, you know.
Yeah.
Because what on earth do you cut to after she throws herself under a train, and that's the end. You need to be able to cut to Levin after the train pulls into the station, as it were.
When you started making the movie, did you have that idea in mind that you wanted to include them? Or?
Yeah, very much so.
Okay.
Very much so. I mean, that was something that Tom Stoppard and I. There were two things that we came up with. 3, 4, maybe more. But it was a film about love, and love in all its forms. And so therefore, if there was a scene about love, then it would be in the film. If there was a scene about love in the book, then it would be in the film. And if it was about farming practices of the 19th century, then it probably wouldn't. And then this idea that therefore you had to see everyone's version of love, including Levin's. But you know, every character is in love in some way. Anna's obsessive love for Vronsky, Vronsky's idealistic love for Anna. Karenin's, cuckolded love for Anna, her love for her son's love for her love for her brother's love for everybody, his wife's love for him, her sister, Levin, all works as a kind of a riddle on love, really.
Well, this is the third film you worked with Keira Knightley. Now, how was the working relationship has evolved from the time you did Pride together to the time you did Anna together, and what do you think Keira brought to the character of Anna Karenina?
Well, Keira, when we met before we made Pride and Prejudice, she was 17, and so she was a kid. And she brought this wonderful youthful energy and exuberance to the role. She was 21 when we made Atonement, and she was kind of, she was trying to grow into this kind of adult role, but it wasn't quite working yet. There was growing pains there. And then I didn't see her for a little while, and we met up again a couple of years later, and I discovered that she'd developed into this, the growing pains were over, and she developed into this incredibly mature, strong, centered, confident in her own intellect, in her own emotional validity, and in her own sexuality, and so all of those things were what I wanted to bear witness to on screen. But really we're kind of like siblings. We just love each other very much, and sometimes really wind each other up.
I'm really interested in this multiple forms of love thing. And what I really appreciated about the film was that I've read some of Anna Karenina, but I didn't make it through the whole thing. But it was very complex, and you brought that complexity in with the different characters, and you could tell that they all loved each other. What do you think that, and in that setting, and something old and in a different culture, what do you think they have to say to us today?
I think those emotions are exactly the same today as they were then, and I don't really consider period films to be a kind of historical reenactment. For me, they are fantasies. I've no idea what it was like to live in Russia in the 1870s, you know. You kind of think you do, and then suddenly you're in Manhattan without an electricity, and you go, fucking hell, this is what it must have been like, you know. So, you know, it's, you know, I'm not after social contemporary relevance, but I am interested in emotional, spiritual relevance. And those things are eternal, you know.
Human nature doesn't change.
No, I think the brain changes, and I think we adapt and we do change, but the essentials are kind of the same, really.
I know you mentioned to, I think, John, before about when, I guess, reading the book or when you were watching the Greta Garbo version, how you felt that she was, you know, a martyr and a heroine. When I left the film, I did feel for her very much at the end, whereas I don't know if that would be the same for everybody. Is that what you had hoped people would kind of feel for her at the end? Like, how do you want people to feel for her as a character as they leave the film?
As they leave the film, I'd want them to empathise, and at points during the film, I'd want them to empathise, but I don't think they need to empathise at every step of the way. I think, like any relationship between humans, there are points where it's easier, and there are points where it's not so easy.
Right.
And so it's that ambivalence, it's that kind of that she has confronted us and challenged us, but in the end, I certainly love her.
Right, because there's definitely certain points, especially in scenes with Vronsky, Aaron Johnson, that you kind of, she looks a little bit wacko, and then but at the end, overall, I really did feel for her. So that's interesting that you.
I mean, I think there are times I've seen women look a bit wacko, and so there is a kind of. I think she's a very feminine creature. I think she's a very woman creature, you know. And I think that's one of the most extraordinary things about Tolstoy's portrait of her. You know, women are sometimes very difficult, and I think Anna is sometimes very difficult. But I think that difficulty makes her human, and at the same time, that difficulty becomes a pathology and goes way further than most of our normal experience.
How did this story originally come to you? Were you a fan of the book growing up?
No, I read the book much later in life, and
but before you did the movie.
Yeah. And you know, it's one of those books that I read thinking, well, it's fine, I can read this, I'm safe, because there have been lots of adaptations of it before, and anyway, it's kind of impossible to do, so I'm going to read this and I'll never want to make a movie of it. And then I kind of read it and don't want to make a movie of it.
So after you read the book, that's when you decided you wanted to make it into a movie?
Yeah,
okay.
Pretty much.
All right, well, now that you've done Pride and Prejudice and you've done Anna Karenina, is there another classic tale you want to adapt into a movie one day?
I'd like one day to do an adaptation of The Little Mermaid, a live-action version. I guess that's a very classic tale. I don't know. I've learned that it's fairly useless to try and have too many preconceived ideas about the future, because, you know, I find it doesn't really happen. other things happen instead.
Please do a Little Mermaid.
Are you talking about the classic one where she turns into sea foam?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not the Disney version.
Right. It's much darker.
Yeah, it's really.
That was my favorite. growing
Please
up.
do the version that you're talking about.
Right.
Try.